Avoidants don't return when you're waiting, because waiting keeps the emotional cord alive, and that cord feels like pressure to their nervous system. You can be silent, you can be polite, you can even be doing no contact. But if internally you are still hoping, still scanning, still counting days, still imagining what you'll say when they come back, your energy is not truly calm. It's suspended. It's on standby. And avoidants are incredibly sensitive to that kind of energetic expectation. They may not be able to explain it, but they feel it as a subtle demand in the atmosphere. Soon I will have to deal with emotion. Soon I will have to respond. Soon I will have to reassure. That anticipation is exactly what makes them stay away. When you're waiting, you're still emotionally available on command. Even if you haven't sent a message, your life is partially paused. Your mood still rises and falls based on whether they might reach out. Your nervous system is still oriented around them. And here's the painful truth: an avoidant can sense that you're still reachable. They sense you're still holding the door open. That makes the separation feel less final, less risky, less real. And because it doesn't feel real, it doesn't activate the part of them that recognizes loss. Avoidants regulate closeness by controlling distance. That's their strategy. When things feel too intimate, too emotionally intense, too expectation heavy, they create space. They pull back, go quiet, get busy, minimize, detach. But they usually do this while still believing access will remain. They can step away and assume you'll still be there. Waiting confirms that assumption. Waiting says, you can keep distance without consequence. It tells their nervous system, I still have control. And when they have control, they don't need to return. They can return whenever they want, so there's no urgency. The bond feels preserved without effort. This is why chasing rarely works and waiting rarely works either. Chasing increases pressure. Waiting preserves predictability. Both keep the avoidant from feeling the true emotional contrast of absence. The avoidant's nervous system only wakes up when the pattern breaks, when distance no longer produces the same outcome. When you stop waiting, you stop being predictable. And unpredictability is what forces them to pay attention. Think about how humans value things. We value what we might lose. Not because we're evil, but because certainty makes the brain relax. When something is guaranteed, the brain stops scanning for it. It stops appreciating it. It assumes it will be there. Many avoidants don't come back because they assume you'll always be emotionally accessible, even after months. They assume you'll respond if they check in. They assume your heart is still attached. Waiting feeds that certainty. So their system stays in relief mode longer because they don't have to face the reality that their choices cost them something. Waiting also keeps you in a vulnerable emotional position. And that vulnerability creates pressure the moment contact resumes. If they reach out while you've been waiting, you're likely to respond with intensity, even if you try not to. You'll feel a rush. You'll want answers. You'll want reassurance. You'll want to lock it down quickly because you've been starving. That intensity is exactly what the avoidant fears. So subconsciously, they may avoid reappearing until they feel certain they won't be pulled into that. Your waiting makes them believe you will be pulled into that because you haven't rebuilt your emotional center. The paradox is that the avoidant often returns when you stop waiting because the emotional environment changes. When you're no longer waiting, your energy becomes cleaner. Not cold, cleaner. You're no longer trying to extract an outcome. You're not hovering around the door. You're living. You're engaged with your life. You're no longer emotionally positioned as the one who will always be there no matter what. That shift removes pressure and creates consequence at the same time. Pressure disappears because you don't need them. Consequence appears because they can't assume access. And that combination is what finally activates something inside them: curiosity, attention, sometimes regret, sometimes longing. Because now the absence is real. Now the loss has weight. Now, your silence isn't a pause, it's a separation. Your nervous system is no longer holding space for them. And that's the moment their nervous system starts noticing the space you used to fill. Avoidants don't return when you're hoping because hope keeps your nervous system tied to the outcome. And that tie creates an invisible emotional demand. Hope seems soft and harmless, but psychologically it often keeps you leaning forward, even if you're quiet. It keeps you emotionally on call. You may not realize it, but hope can shape your tone, your timing, your behavior, and even your silence. It makes you interpret everything as a sign. You read into their stories, their likes, their online status. You keep your heart positioned toward them, waiting for the smallest opening to rush back in. And to an avoidant, that leaning energy doesn't feel like love, it feels like expectation waiting to land. Avoidants are hypersensitive to expectation, because expectation implies emotional responsibility. Many avoidants learned early that emotional closeness came with a price. Someone needed too much, someone reacted intensely, someone criticized, someone demanded reassurance, someone made them feel trapped. So their body doesn't respond to closeness with warmth first, it responds with alertness. It's scanning for the moment the relationship becomes heavy. When you're still hoping, even in silence, the avoidant senses that weight is still there. They may not consciously think, they're hoping so I won't return. But they feel an invisible pressure. If I re-enter, I will have to deal with feelings. And because they've trained themselves to avoid feelings, they delay. They stay away. They keep things vague. They keep the door half open but never fully step in. Hope also keeps the dynamic unbalanced. In the old pattern, you were often the emotional holder. You cared more openly, you tried harder, you explained more, you stayed more available. The avoidant could regulate by withdrawing and still feel safe because your attachment remained active. Hope keeps that structure alive. It tells them, I still have emotional access. That access becomes a cushion. When someone is cushioned, they don't feel urgency. They don't feel the consequences of distance. Because the bond still feels intact from their side. They can return whenever they want, which means they don't have to return now. There's another layer hope keeps you emotionally rehearsing. You prepare speeches in your head. You plan the perfect message. You imagine the reunion. You imagine the apology you want. Even if you never send anything, your system is practicing a future moment where they finally come back and make it right. That rehearsal keeps your pain active. It keeps you sensitive, easily triggered, and emotionally primed. And if the avoidant does reach out during this stage, your response often carries that stored intensity. You might try to sound calm, but there's urgency underneath. There's please don't leave again, hiding in your tone. There's I need this to work, behind your words. Avoidants feel that. It makes them cautious. It makes them retreat again, because they sense that you are returning to the old pattern. You leaning in emotionally, them needing to regulate by pulling away. Hope also creates a subtle type of emotional chasing. People think chasing is only texting, calling, begging. But chasing can also be internal. It's the way your mind keeps circling them, the way your day still revolves around what they might do. The way you keep the door open with your heart, even when you pretend it's closed with your behavior. Avoidants often feel chased even when no one is speaking, because the bond still contains tension. And tension is what they run from. When you stop hoping, something shifts. You become emotionally neutral in the best way. You stop projecting a future that needs them to participate in order for you to feel okay. Your nervous system returns to you. You stop making meaning out of their small movements. You stop interpreting silence as a puzzle. And that emotional neutrality is the first time the avoidant feels clean space. Not space filled with longing, not space filled with expectation, just space. Clean space creates two outcomes at once. It removes pressure and introduces consequence. Pressure is gone because you're no longer leaning toward them emotionally. consequence appears because your energy is no longer guaranteeing access. Now, if they want connection, they actually have to choose it. And choice is what activates the avoidance attention. Because they can no longer assume you'll be emotionally available whenever they feel like returning. That's why avoidants don't return when you're hoping. Because hope keeps the bond alive without requiring their action. They return when hope dissolves into acceptance, because only then does absence become real. Avoidants don't return when you're quietly checking your phone and pretending you're fine, because that state is still emotional pursuit, just disguised. On the outside you may look calm, but inside your nervous system is still tethered to them. You're still scanning for contact, still interpreting silence, still measuring your worth against whether they appear. That internal scanning creates tension, and tension is exactly what an avoidant reacts to. Avoidants are not just responding to messages, they're responding to the emotional field around the connection. When the emotional field is full of anticipation, anxiety, and unspoken expectation, they feel it as pressure, even if you say nothing. Quiet checking is powerful because it keeps you stuck in a suspended emotional posture. You're not fully moving forward, but you're not fully letting go. You're hovering. Hovering is what keeps the attachment cord alive. You might tell yourself, I'm not chasing. But if your mind keeps returning to their last scene, their online status, their stories, their likes, or the possibility of a text at any moment, your system is still oriented toward them. That orientation makes you energetically available. And as long as you're energetically available, the avoidant can feel that the door is still open. For an avoidant, a door that is still open is not necessarily comforting. It can be unsettling, because an open door implies that if they walk through, something will be waiting, questions, feelings, conflict, a need for reassurance, a need for clarity. Even if you swear you won't do that, your nervous system often does it automatically when you've been in an anxious waiting state. The avoidant senses that risk. They sense that your calm is fragile. They sense that one small message might unleash a flood. And because they prefer to avoid emotional flooding, they delay. They stay silent. They keep distance. Their nervous system chooses the path of least emotional cost. Pretending you're fine also creates a mismatch between what you feel and what you show. That mismatch produces a kind of emotional static. Humans can sense incongruence. Avoidants especially can sense when someone is holding back. Not because they are intuitive romantics, but because their survival strategy depends on detecting emotional shifts early, so they can escape before it becomes intense. So when you pretend you're fine, while internally you're spiraling, it can actually make them more avoidant. They feel something is there, but it's not being spoken. That unspoken energy can feel more pressuring than direct honesty, because it creates the sense that a heavier moment is coming. Another reason avoidants don't return in this stage is because your checking reinforces their control of the dynamic. If you are checking, you are still giving them psychological power. Your attention is still anchored to their behavior. And even if they don't know it consciously, avoidants often sense when someone is still orbiting them. That orbiting lets them feel safe staying away, because they assume you're still attached. If they believe you're still attached, they don't have to face loss. They don't have to choose. They can keep the situation suspended and return whenever they feel lonely, bored, nostalgic, or curious. This is why avoidants often return only when you stop pretending and actually become okay. Because I'm fine is not a signal to an avoidant, it's a mask. And avoidants respond to nervous system signals, not masks. When you truly move on, the signal changes. You stop checking, not as discipline, but because you don't care in the same desperate way. You stop scanning because your brain is no longer addicted to the hope of a message. You stop waiting for the next hit of validation. Your day becomes full again. Your attention returns to your life. Your nervous system becomes regulated without them. That regulation is what removes the avoidance fear. They sense that if they reach out, they won't be responsible for calming you. They sense that contact won't instantly become a heavy emotional conversation. They sense that you won't collapse if they respond slowly. And simultaneously, they sense something else: you're no longer guaranteed. You're no longer sitting there, quietly suffering, and staying loyal to the possibility of them. You've stepped back into your life in a real way, and this is where curiosity activates in them. Because now, instead of you watching them, they start watching you. Not necessarily online, but psychologically. They wonder why you're quiet in a different way. They wonder why it feels final. They wonder if they misjudged your availability. Quiet checking keeps you predictable. True moving on makes you unpredictable. And unpredictability is what forces the avoidant to confront the reality that distance can lead to permanent loss. When that reality lands, they're more likely to reach out, not because you performed no contact perfectly, but because your nervous system finally detached, and detachment changes the entire emotional climate of the bond. Avoidants return after you move on completely, because moving on breaks the emotional leash they could feel even from a distance. And when the leash disappears, two things happen at the same time. Pressure drops and consequence becomes real. While you're still attached, the connection contains a silent contract, even if it's never spoken. The contract says, you can disappear, and I'll still be here. That contract is what allows an avoidant to regulate closeness by controlling distance. They can pull away without fully losing you. They can keep the bond in a suspended state, where they get relief from intensity, but don't have to face the finality of loss. As long as that contract is alive, they don't have to return urgently. They can return whenever it feels convenient, safe, or emotionally manageable. Moving on ends the contract. And the moment the contract ends, the avoidant's nervous system loses one of its quiet forms of control: guaranteed access. Guaranteed access is not love. It's a safety net. Many avoidants keep people emotionally near, without being fully present, because emotional nearness allows them to avoid vulnerability while still benefiting from connection. When you move on completely, that nearness disappears. It's not just that you stop texting. It's that you stop belonging to the dynamic. You stop revolving around them. You stop waiting. You stop hoping. You stop scanning. Your life becomes yours again. And the avoidant can feel that shift because the energetic pull they used to sense is gone. The first thing that happens when you move on is the pressure vanishes. This matters because avoidants don't respond well to pressure, even gentle pressure. Pressure is the feeling that someone needs something from them emotionally. When you're still attached, your communication, if it happens at all, often contains hidden weight. Even a simple, "How are you?" can carry the undertone of, "Please prove you still care." Even silence can carry the undertone of, "I'm waiting for you to come back." Avoidants sense those undertones as obligation. Moving on removes them. You're no longer trying to extract reassurance. You're no longer trying to restore the bond. You're no longer trying to manage the relationship from the outside. That creates a clean emotional environment where contact, if it happens, feels optional rather than demanded. But the second thing that happens is even more important: consequence becomes real. Consequence is what avoidant systems often avoid feeling. While you are attached, the avoidant can believe, "This isn't over. I still have them." They might not say it, but it's there. This belief allows them to delay grief, delay regret, delay accountability. It allows them to stay numb. Moving on forces reality into the room. Suddenly, it's not, "I'm taking space." It's, "I might have lost access." Suddenly, their distance isn't a strategy, it's a risk. And risk activates attention. This is why curiosity begins only after you move on. Curiosity is the avoidant's first emotional step back toward you. It's the internal question. Are they really gone? Are they seeing someone else? Why does this feel different? Why am I not hearing from them? And the reason curiosity appears is because your absence has weight now. It's not the absence of a person who is waiting. It's the absence of a person who is living. That's the difference between a door that's still open and a door that has quietly been closed. Moving on also changes your value in their perception, not because you become more lovable, but because you become less available. Availability without boundaries often gets taken for granted. Boundaries create respect. When an avoidant senses you have boundaries, they begin to see you as someone they can't keep on the shelf. A shelf relationship is where they can pick you up when they want warmth and put you down when they want space. Many avoidants don't realize they're doing this. It's a coping mechanism. Moving on removes you from the shelf. It communicates, I'm not an option. I'm a choice you must actively make. And the most paradoxical part is that your moving on can make you feel safer to them. Because a person who has moved on is not emotionally volatile. They are not desperate. They are not going to flood the avoidant with intensity if contact resumes. They are less likely to demand immediate closeness. They are less likely to collapse into anxiety if the avoidant moves slowly. That steadiness lowers the emotional cost of reaching out. The avoidant can send a small message without fearing they'll trigger a storm. They can test the waters without being punished. They can approach without feeling trapped. So they return after you move on completely, because only then does the relationship stop feeling like a pressure-filled obligation and start feeling like a real choice with real consequences. Your detachment removes the invisible leash and replaces it with reality. Access is no longer guaranteed. And once access is no longer guaranteed, the avoidant's attention finally wakes up to what their distance might have cost them. Avoidants return after you move on completely, because when you move on, you stop rewarding their distance with free emotional access, and that changes the entire cost of staying avoidant. In the old dynamic, distance was comfortable for them, because it came with a hidden benefit. You stayed emotionally connected even when they weren't present. You might have been hurt, confused, or anxious, but the bond remained available. They could withdraw, get relief, and still assume that if they came back later, you'd respond. That assumption is one of the most powerful regulators for an avoidant nervous system. It lets them keep autonomy without fully losing attachment. When you move on, you remove that benefit. You don't punish them. You don't threaten them. You don't chase them. You simply stop providing emotional access that costs them nothing. That's what many people don't understand. Avoidants often aren't addicted to you. They're addicted to the comfort of having you in the background. They like the idea that connection exists, without the responsibility of maintaining it consistently. Moving on ends the background connection. It forces reality. Connection requires presence. This is why avoidants often return, only after you've stopped. Keeping the door open. Keeping the door open can look like occasional check-ins, friendly messages, replying instantly, staying available for late night conversations, accepting crumbs, or even just being visibly emotionally affected by them online. Even if you don't intend it, those behaviors signal, you still matter enough to move me. That signal lets them relax into distance. They don't have to step forward because you're still energetically reaching. When you move on, your energy becomes neutral. You don't jump at their crumbs. You don't react to their silence. You don't leave your life paused for their return. You become less responsive, not out of bitterness, but because you're no longer centered on them. And that neutrality does something powerful. It removes the emotional payoff of avoidance. If they disappear, they don't get the comfort of knowing you're still there waiting. If they return, they don't automatically receive intimacy. They have to earn it through consistent behavior. Suddenly, their usual strategy, withdraw and then reappear, doesn't guarantee the same reward. This is when the avoidance nervous system starts recalculating. People assume avoidants don't care, but many do care. they just regulate differently. Their system prioritizes freedom over emotional processing. But when the reward changes, their attention changes. They begin to notice that distance is no longer safe because it might lead to a permanent loss of access. They start feeling something that avoidance tries to avoid: consequence. Consequence doesn't mean guilt, it means reality. If I keep doing this, I might actually lose them. That realization is the first thing strong enough to cut through avoidance. Another reason they return after you move on is because your moving on makes you emotionally safer. When you're attached, their return feels risky because they can sense your hunger for reassurance. They can sense you want the relationship to be resolved immediately. They can sense that you're carrying stored pain that might spill out the moment they text. That's not a judgment of you. It's normal after inconsistency. But for an avoidant, that stored intensity feels like a storm waiting behind the door. So they avoid opening the door. When you move on, you become less stormy. Your nervous system is more regulated. You're less likely to flood them with emotion, interrogate them, or demand immediate clarity. You're less likely to turn a small check into a big emotional conversation. That lowers the emotional cost of reaching out. They feel they can approach without being swallowed. Now here's the part that protects you: avoidance, returning after you move on, is not always a sign they're ready. Sometimes they return because they miss the comfort of access, not because they've developed the skills for intimacy. That's why your moved on energy is crucial. It prevents you from being pulled back into the old cycle. You don't treat their return as proof. You treat it as a test of consistency. You let their actions do the talking. You keep your boundaries quiet but firm. You don't hand back full access just because they reappeared. In other words, moving on changes the terms. The relationship is no longer built on you chasing and them withdrawing. It becomes built on choice and effort. If they want you, they have to show up. And this is exactly why avoidants so often return only after you move on. Because only then do they lose the free benefits of distance. Only then does the reality of losing you become real. And only then does approaching you feel emotionally safe enough to attempt again.